I always encourage people to be curious, to go out to eat in foods of new cultures. So you will always have these memory taste cards, and you'll remember, oh, well, that time I was in Vietnam sitting on the beach eating the most delicious shrimp roll. And if you know that the 4 things that will help you get that taste are salt, fat, acid, and heat, then you can go toward that. But if you don't know where you're headed, how do you know if you're on the right path?
You're listening to the Taste Podcast. I'm Editor-in-Chief Matt Rodbard, here with Senior Editor Anna Hezel.
So for today's episode, it's really exciting. We have Samin Nosrat, who is the author of James Beard award-winning cookbook Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat. Later on, we'll also be talking to Deb Perelman from Smitten Kitchen, who's going to take a question from a reader. But first of all, let's talk about Samin.
She's one of my favorite food writers around. She really breaks down complex subjects into simple speak. This book has sold over 100,000 copies. She writes a column for the New York Times Magazine. She has a show in production on Netflix. The conversation was really fun. I think the thing I took away from it the most was kosher salt, the difference between Crystal Diamond and Morton's.
Is there a difference?
Oh, hell yeah, there's a difference. And we went over it, and we also handed out a bowl of salt to the audience.
Could you taste the difference in a blind test, do you think?
I think, yeah, we definitely did. The audience was really into it. Some of them might have been snorting it at the end.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, it was pretty illicit.
Here's Matt talking to Samin at Books Are Magic in Brooklyn.
I love your book. Like the first oh fuck moment that I got. It's about kosher salt. Yeah. So kosher salt is not the same.
No, it's not the same.
This box of Morton kosher salt is double the salt of the box of Diamond Crystal.
Yeah.
That is remarkable. I mean, because basically I've been cooking with the same boxes, right? Yeah. Like interchangeable, for
not interchangeable. Do you know? Can I tell a little story? I don't think it made it into the book, but my friend Jill Santopietro, she used to work at the Times. She did a lot of recipe testing for the Times Magazine. And do you remember, I don't know, however many years ago, there were those New York Times Magazine chocolate chip cookies that took the internet by storm. Everyone was resting them and all that stuff. She tested that recipe 22 times. They ran the recipe. It just said kosher salt, help for the salt. And the next day somebody was like, this is wrote it, Also people love to write angry letters to the New York Times. So, and someone was like, this is inedible. It's disgusting. It's like a salt lick. It's so horrible. And she hadn't specified that she had used Diamond Crystal and other people were using Morton. So that was this kind of mind-blowing moment for her. Yeah.
And this is just one of 5,000 little notes I wrote in my iPhone when reading your book, because this book, and my first kind of question is, this book is not an average or typical cookbook. There are certainly recipes, but those are in the back. The book is to be read, I would say. You actually can put this on your nightstand as much as in your kitchen. So how do we negotiate this? Without having formal recipes in the first, I would say, 3/4 of the book? How do we use it? And the second part is, you say in the book that you have these little experiments that you want us to make. So tell us about the experiments.
Sure. I was a writer before I was ever a cook. And I've always loved reading, since I can remember. So to me, to write a book that was readable was really important. Yeah. And I went through so many different iterations of how to organize this book and how to share this information. First, it was going to be 12 essays. Then it was going to be, there were so many different ways. And so, but all throughout it was this constant that I wanted it to be readable. So to me, it was really important, to the point where we actually have a how to use this book in the beginning. And it's please read the book. Yeah.
Please read the book.
Yeah. And so as I've become a better cook and learned how to teach other people how to cook, I really realized quite early that telling stories is a great way to teach a lesson. As far as the kitchen experiments go, a lot of the time I feel like you won't trust me. There's only so much I can do if I'm just some character who wrote a book and it's on the page. So if I can show you something simple to do that you can do at home and you can see and taste the difference for yourself, then that's going to stick with you so much more. So if you salt one chicken the day before and one chicken right before, and you put them both in the oven, and the one that was salted the day before practically butchers itself, that is going to go so much farther than anything that I could tell you, and you'll remember the importance of that.
So the title, for some who may not know, the title is Salt, Fat, Acid, and Heat. So those are the 4 most important tenets of cooking you've deduced in this text. Did you always have in your mind these are the 4 most important tenets, or did you negotiate like maybe there was 3 and acid was, you realized that was no, acid's important? Explain the organization a little bit and how you came to those 4 important tenets.
It was definitely something that coalesced all at once for me, over time, basically. So the story that sums it up is a series of serendipitous events brought me into the kitchen of Chez Panisse restaurant in Berkeley, which is Alice Waters' incredible institution. And I had to beg for this job, and it was so enchanting and inspiring and sensual in there. And I just immediately knew I wanted to learn how to do what these people were doing. But I didn't know anything about cooking. And so I would show up every day. The menu changes every day. And I'd sit at this menu meeting, and the chef had this, he would have written a menu based on what was in season and what we had and what he was inspired by and some trip that he took last summer to San Sebastian. And he would say, okay, like, you're going to make paella, you're going to make gazpacho, you're going to do this, you're going to do this. And everyone except me would just get up and go make it.
Right.
And in the meantime, he had given me this list of cookbooks to read and really told me to cook from cookbooks. So it wasn't lining up what I was seeing them do, which was they never used recipes. They never measured anything. They didn't
measure anything. Like, there were no cups, there were no gallons.
There's there's big 8-cup measures, which are more for knowing, like, for 100 people, which is how many they serve downstairs, you make 8 cups of polenta. There was sort of that, but there was no, like, very precise measuring spoon, none of that.
And for spices especially.
No, all of that was by taste.
By
and
taste.
And I'm talking about the savory kitchen. In the pastry kitchen, they measure everything. It was really disorienting for me because I had I didn't know the difference between really basic things. I didn't know cumin from fennel seed, and the spice labels weren't labeled spice, this jar. So they would be like, go get cumin. And I'd come back with, and it was like always very embarrassing. And so, but eventually I started to notice that there were these patterns. There were things that they were always doing every day, no matter what. First of all, they were always tasting everything all the time before we started, while we were cooking, before we served the food, as we were serving the food, always adjusting. The thing we were most commonly adjusting with was salt. That was the most important thing to get right. And also every single day we would go down into the butchery room and butcher the meat for the next day and salt it. So it didn't matter if tomorrow it was going to be barbecued pork or roasted chicken or Italian, braised beef. It was always salted. It didn't matter the culture. Same thing happened for me with fat. I started to see these patterns that they would pay attention. Butter always had to be cold on the pastry side, and oil had to be hot before you put something into a pan. Acid, every time we tasted, they were always like, this needs a little acid, which was this clinical word that I didn't know what that meant. And I realized over time they really just meant some lemon juice or vinegar, or sometimes cheese. The goat cheese is acidic. Anything acidic that would sort of create balance and brighten food. And you would, and because I was standing there with my little spoon behind them all, I was too nervous to get in there and give my own opinion, but I would taste it before and taste it after they fixed it, and it would explode with flavor in my mouth. And so I saw, and so salt, fat, acid is very much this thing all cooks talk about. Salt, fat, acid, salt, fat, acid. I was always hearing that. And heat, is cooking. And again, there were not really any temperatures on the oven dials. There was a way where these guys had equal facility with the wood oven or the grill. If we ran out of space on the stove, they'd be like, just build a fire and cook over that. Put the pot over that. I was like, what?
There's no knobs.
It was insane. And so
I'll say this. I'll interrupt you and say that there's a really cute illustration that shows the knob of an oven, and every number on it is scratched out with this Sharpie.
Yeah, and it says Samin was here. Yeah.
And it says Samin was here. And I love that Samin is here, Samin is there, part of your narrative. We can talk about that.
Totally.
But temperature is less important.
Yeah, and then temperature, it's not so much the temperature, it's just understanding what's happening to your food. So you could be braising something on the stove, and that's just bringing it up to a boil, turning it down to a simmer. You could be doing it in the oven, and the temperature is not important. It's being at a simmer is what it's important. You could do it in a pinch. I have a friend here who doesn't have a kitchen. She only has a grill. Yeah. So she just cooks everything.
Boils some water on the grill.
She boils her water on the grill. She braises her stuff on the grill. So you get to this point where it doesn't matter what the source of heat is. It matters what's happening in the pan. And I really did have a beautiful mind moment of the salt, fat, acid, heat. And I came to the chef and I said, I figured this out. I figured out what you guys all like. I'm a brilliant genius, salt, fat, acid, heat. I'm Albert Einstein of cooking. And he just looked at me. He's like, yeah, we all know that, And And I felt kind of betrayed because I was like, you're sending me home to read cookbooks. This is not written anywhere. None of you have told me this over the past 2 years. I had to figure this out by myself. So to me, once I knew it, there was not another thing that there wasn't part of it that was less important. And there wasn't another thing. This was it.
They're equally distributed too. I think the chapters have equal length or really close to equal length for the
more
most
or less.
part.
I mean, and certainly acid is a little bit less scientific and more about taste. And so like the chapter might be shorter, but to me, it's no less of an important, like to me, actually salt and acid are the things I always, if it's off, like to me, I can't enjoy food. So
what's the most like perfectly balanced dish that uses those 4 tenets?
Ooh.
Did I really stump you? You've done like a billion interviews.
I know, but that's a very specific and weird question.
It is a weird question.
Because anything can do
Yeah,
that. Like
yeah.
I'm trying to think of like what's a really, I mean, I'm a broken record. I always say Caesar salad.
Yeah,
that
was in my
because
head.
it's like creamy. There's multiple forms of salt. There's anchovies and Worcestershire sauce and Parmesan cheese. And I always pound my garlic with a pinch of salt to help it get really, fine. And then you add actual salt. And then there's lemon juice and vinegar, 2 kinds of acid. So it's all about balance. Anything, in fact, I would say anything like that that's like creamy, but also you want it to be acidic because otherwise it'll be just too rich. Those kinds of things where you have to taste them 50 times while you're making it, and then by the time you're ready to eat, you don't want to eat anymore. That's
I love that you call this Judy Rogers quote, recipes don't make food taste good, people do. So this is like an anti-recipe statement.
Yes, girl.
Yes, girl. I mean, I think cookbook publishers are in the business of creating books that have recipes in them, but this is not the case for this book. So let's just explain a little bit more about how the recipes work in your book.
Well, if I had had my way, I wouldn't have put any recipes in the book.
Yeah.
But that, as you said, is not the publishing way. So,
Okay.
So it wasn't going to happen. Like it just wasn't really an option for me. So I had to figure out how I could put recipes in and feel like I was still being true to myself and my message. Because I'm writing a whole book telling you don't need recipes to cook and then following it with like that's kind of hypocritical. Yeah. So I had to figure out like what's the story that connects these. And also, like I teach these classes. I teach salt, fat, acid, heat over and over. Like people come for these series 20 hours, 30 hours, 40 hours. And always like we'll be doing it together. We'll make our Caesar salad and we're tasting and I'm like, hey guys, what does this need? And they're like, Parmesan. I'm like, yeah. And they tasted their way there and I feel so proud of them and they feel like they can totally do it. And then we get to the end of the class and they're like, cool, where's the recipe packet? I'm like,
It's the card.
Like we made it all the way here and now you want a recipe packet? And so I realized people need that, right? People need, I can't just push them into the deep end. They need a little help. They need some hand holding. And also, if I could just give you the glasses through which to look at recipes, then I've done my job. It doesn't matter.
Near the end of the heat chapter, you get in the idea of knowing what you want in the kitchen before you actually cook the dish. You have to know what you want. This is related to not cooking with recipes. Can you explain what that means? Well,
especially if you just pull it up on Google and you're like, that looks good, I'll make that.
Because you have 5 minutes, and that's what a lot of home cooks, they have 6 minutes to cook their dinner.
Totally. And I think, with any, I would say creative pursuit, but creative in the way of that you're creating something. So anytime you're making something, whatever it is, you can't get there unless you know what there is. Yeah. And that's probably true of anybody who, and this is not to say that all artists know what their finished painting will look like, but you probably can envision or feel the feeling of what you want it to feel like. Mm-hmm. Or, you have something that is your guide, your internal compass saying, oh yeah, I'm veering off course, or no, I'm staying on the path. And so with cooking, for me, I always encourage people to be curious, to go out to eat in foods of new cultures, to travel, to try new things. And the more of that you do, the more rich and richly detailed your mental filing cabinet of taste cards will be. And so you will always have these memory taste cards and you'll remember, oh, well, that time I was in Vietnam sitting on the beach eating the most delicious shrimp roll. I want that taste. So you can pull that taste up and go for it. And if you know that the 4 things that will help you get that taste are salt, fat, acid, and heat, then you can travel this path, or you can open recipes and be able to, the person might say, add 2 tablespoons of salt, and you're like, well, if I add 2 tablespoons of salt, is there really going to be room for me to add fish sauce too? And I want that fish sauce because that's the Vietnamese taste. So you can use your judgment more. So I think knowing what it is that you're after, knowing that you're after browned skin and a tender inside meat on your chicken, or knowing that you're after, I don't know, whatever, like a really bright salad, then you can go toward that. But if you don't know where you're headed, how do you know if you're on the right path?
So you speak about like food in a very visual sense. You're talking about these cards. And I think we haven't really talked about the visual elements in the cookbook because it's remarkable. This is one of the most imaginative cookbooks I've seen in years. It really is. It's just dense with information, but it's presented in such a flawless and simple way. Explain the flavor wheel and how that came about.
Well, for me, it really started way back at Chez Panisse, where every day we were cooking foods from different cultures. And over time, I was seeing, wait a minute, there aren't really that many different things we do here. We braise something every day, and sometimes it's like with rosé and lavender, and tomorrow it's with red wine from Chianti and rosemary, and then it'll be with preserved lemons and Moroccan spices. But we're still doing the same thing to the chicken every time. So once I realized, like, oh, there's only sort of so many ways that somebody cooks something, I realized I needed to learn and understand what all the different flavors of the world were so I could apply them. And suddenly the roast chicken that I had could be 20 different roast chickens. And I could make tacos or pho or, all these different things. I don't know why I said pho, because you wouldn't make that with roast chicken. But you get my point. Yeah. And so, when I met Wendy McNaughton, who I stalked at length, she's this incredible illustrator and visual storyteller and masterful artist, really. She didn't know how to cook at all. And so our journey together was really one of learning for both of us, where I had to learn how she made stories visual, and she had to learn what it was that I was trying to get across. And so I came to her and I said, what I want you to do is make this 2-page drawing of the world, a map of the world, and then on every country in teeny tiny handwriting, you can write the important things. And she was like, that's insane, because then you have to know where Bolivia is and also everything won't fit. You're crazy, not going to happen. And so, but once I explained to her the concept at work that then she was able to sort of tell me, what you want is a flow chart. This is a flow chart where you say, I want this country, that leads me to the next thing, leads me to the next thing. But it's a flow chart with many different options. And so when you fold that upon itself, it becomes a wheel. So she very quickly, and then we worked with an incredibly brilliant book designer, Alvaro Villanueva, and he was the one who told us, you can't do that on just a 2-page spread because half the information will get lost in the gutter. So he was like, we really have to do this fold out, which caused great grief for my publisher, but ultimately I think paid off.
It executed pretty well. No, absolutely. Tell me, are there some cookbooks that inspired you?
So many.
Visually?
I love, it's called 75. There's these books that are 75 herbs for your garden, 75 fruits for your garden. I just have been a collector of illustrated cookbooks for a long time. So there's Alan Davidson, who was this incredible academic. He wrote a super beautiful illustrated book of both fish and fruits that are, I don't know, I just love, I've really always gravitated toward illustration. At the same time, I love beautiful food photography. I have a lot of friends who are fantastic photographers. I just knew that photography wouldn't serve this book. And so it almost from the first moment, I just knew it couldn't be photographed.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of work that goes into a fully illustrated book because you really have to draft and round, right?
We were best. I mean, we still are each other's number one, phoned person. I mean, if she has a wife, so if she has a fiance, so I'm number
You're
two.
Number
she's
two.
my number one.
Let's jump back into the cooking. We kind of were talking about book production, and now let's get back into cooking. You talk about Too-Mami, which I think
Too-Mami.
is really funny. Too-Mami as in too much umami. And I think it's really in this era of the Brussels sprouts that have fish sauce and bacon and crusted with Parmesan. You're not endorsing over seasoning your food.
It's like low-hanging fruit to do that.
So explain Too-Mami and how we should not fall into that trap as home cooks, the Too-Mami trap.
So, Too-Mami is what you said, where you were these things are so good, so I'm just going to put them all in this thing. And umami is, to me, I always joke, my memoir will be called, Parmesan on everything, or something. I do, and,
in Italy.
Totally. And Parmesan and Heinz ketchup are sort of two of the most powerful and rich sources of umami for us in the kitchen. And they also, Parmesan is also a source of salt and acid, and Heinz ketchup. Heinz ketchup is the only ketchup, guys.
It truly is.
Yeah.
You say that casually, like Heinz ketchup is in the book, and I kind of pause. It's like, you really love ketchup.
I love ketchup. Yeah, and it's sweet, it's salty, it's acidic, and it makes I'm like the condiment lady at my house. My fridge is just all condiments. And so, because a condiment can make the simplest thing or something that's not that good, and it can do it at the last second when you're tired and you don't feel like doing much. So, I'm tired and don't feel like doing much a lot. So, yeah.
So you are tired when you come home and
all the time.
And need to make dinner. Because I think that's a big issue everywhere. But, in New York, we kind of we work a lot. Like, we work till 7, work till 8, work till 9. We all kind of want to cook more. So how do you break through that fatigue?
Some of it is thinking ahead, and I was cooking batches, not even planning so much, but just making more of. I believe in leftovers, and I also think making something that's pretty a neutral flavor, like a pretty basic. Roast your chicken with no spices on it, and then tomorrow add some cumin and turn it into tacos. The next day you can put the bones in a pot with some star anise and make faux broth out of that. And then suddenly you get 3 different countries' flavors out of one bird. And make your one pot of beans, and it can become all these different things. I definitely think that's a good tool, but you also shouldn't beat yourself up because it's hard. It's hard to be a human. But also make your life easy. Stock your pantry. I have a lot of quinoa around. I have a lot of jasmine rice around. Yeah. Jasmine rice cooks in 20 minutes. You put it on the stove. By the time it's done, I have time to cook some kale, fry an egg, put some hot sauce or Parmesan on it.
I want to call this our let's talk about food trends moment in this chat, because you're really on top of your stuff and you have opinions. So when you think about the Blue Aprons, Green Chefs of the world, the component box cooking, I heard a sigh over here.
I also sighed too. Yeah.
You may have sighed. So what do you think about those?
I have complicated feelings about it. I used to be unilaterally against it. To me, the greatest joy of cooking, the part I take the most pleasure of is the shopping. I love going to the grocery store. I love tasting all the different cherry tomatoes and choosing which one I'm going to buy. I love that. But also, it's kind of a drag if you have kids. And also, I live in a teeny tiny bubble called Berkeley, where it's really fun to go to the grocery store because every day a new farmer has delivered a new variety of plums. Yeah. And when I travel outside of that, and I see beyond that, and I come and I stay in this neighborhood a lot. And I understand now. There's a vegetable store on Atlantic that I love. And
on Henry,
and I go in there and I'm like, oh my God, they have the same broccoli rabe that I buy at home, literally the same farm, which is really awesome because I love that farm. But it's coming all the way from California, so there isn't this great luxury. Shopping is much more, and also in New York, man, you don't have a car like most people. You take it on the subway. So I've loosened my views, and I also have some friends who really love Blue Apron, and they feel like they've learned a lot about cooking, and it's
training wheels in some sense. Okay, the next trend or the issue is sous vide. What do you think about it? You don't mention it really in your book.
Consciously. Okay, so what is sous vide? What does sous vide mean? It means under vacuum, translates to under vacuum, and it's when food is put in usually a plastic bag, and the air is taken out, and then it's put in a low temperature water bath, much lower than simmering, for a very long period of time. And what happens when you do that is because the temperature is so gentle and the cooking method is so gentle, and it happens over such a long period of time, sometimes overnight or even more
12 hours for
many
meat.
Hours. Yeah. There's much less risk of it being overcooked. You just have a much greater control and precision. To me, what the kernel lesson of heat is what I said earlier, which is to know how your food is cooking, you watch your food. You don't watch the heat source. Yeah. And what are you doing when you're watching food? You're tuning in with your senses. So you're smelling the browning starting to happen. You're seeing the browning starting to happen. You poke the thing to see if it's tender. You taste it. And you smell, see, say, I don't know, whatever. You hear the sizzle. Thank you. And you have to be aware. And as you get to a point where you cook more and more, you start to learn those sensory signals. I can often hear now, I can be 2 rooms away and I can hear chicken, accidentally when fat renders out of a chicken when it's cooking, it'll change from just cooking to starting to fry in its own fat. And I'll be like, oh, I got to come back because I can hear that change. And if you put the thing in the plastic bag and put it in the water and set the timer and walk away, you are not using your senses. To me, even though it's the most precise form of cooking, because you have this like incredible precision, that is actually in a lot of ways to me the least powerful and the least sort of exemplary of what I consider to be good cooking.
Well said, the anti-sous vide lobby.
Thanks.
Like, that's really good. I think one thing, too, about sous vide, just to note, is that you can hold temperature for a long time. So if you, like, miss your window to serve, you can then preserve that. I think that's one application.
I do think the eggs are awesome. Also, I'm not, like, super into putting my food in plastic and warm water all night. That's kind of weirds me out. And, but you can do the eggs, and the eggs come conveniently on their own shell. And you put those in the water, and there's no plastic involved. And the sous vide eggs are like little custard. You open it up, it's like a little custard. It's really good.
The last trend, and then we can get to some questions, is queso.
Do you guys know what queso is?
Queso.
I only learned about this from a cook who I worked with, who was from Texas. It's a block of Velveeta cheese and a can of Rotel chilies. Is it Rotel salsa? I thought it was Rotel tomatoes with chilies. Yeah, and you put it in like a crock pot. And it melts, and it's like the yummiest, cheesy, tomato-y chili thing. It's so delicious. Also, I deeply love queso. I love any processed cheese thing. My friend invited me to go to this baseball game and sit in this like fancy booth with her. I don't even like baseball, but I was like, is there going to be nachos? Like stadium nachos.
It's so one of the best food.
And then the same friend a couple weeks later was like, do you want to come over for 4th of July? I'm making hot dogs. I was like, will you have American cheese?
And speaking of salt, like nacho, like the liquid cheese nachos, you need to have over-salted chips, right?
Yeah.
You have to have it. They're undersalted, you're screwed.
And then you're really thirsty and you're like, I'm going to drink some drink that's really bad for me. Yeah.
Thank you, Samin, for being here. I appreciate it.
Thanks,
Thank
Matt.
you, everybody.
Up next, we're talking to Deb Perelman of Smitten Kitchen, asking her a few questions about lasagna. I've been on a real lasagna kick this winter, and I know that you've developed lasagna recipes before. I've had your mushroom lasagna from Smitten Kitchen. That's great. I was wondering, do you have strong opinions about lasagna? It's like a controversial topic. There are ricotta people, there are bechamel people, there are mozzarella people.
Interesting.
Where do you stand on these?
I tend to prefer, I don't really care for baked ricotta at all. I just don't like it in pasta bakes. I don't like it in... I don't care for it. I find that it just gets drier in the oven and you get kind of this wet, dry separation, and it's not my favorite. I'm so much more, once I had bechamel lasagna, I was like, oh, I think I like lasagna now. I also like ones where I guess I don't mind mozzarella all the time, but I often feel like it can detract the heaviness. Like I feel like one of the things I love about that Ina Garten recipe, it's the mushroom one, which I've tweaked from her over the years because I use less fancy mushrooms mostly, is that you think it would be so rich, but I feel like with the bechamel and the sautéed vegetables and like, it doesn't feel like an arterial assault. It's got a really good flavor and the edges get really crispy.
Do you fall into a particular camp when it comes to types of pasta? Do you use the instant noodles? Do you use the regular boil noodles? Do you use fresh pasta?
Okay, definitely fresh pasta if you can pull it off. It's definitely a bit of work, although theoretically it should be the easiest because maybe you even have a deli where, like, maybe you have some place where you can buy sheets of freshly made pasta and you could maybe just roll it out a little bit thinner and just patch that on. What I love is that if you're making it at home from fresh pasta, which of course is not something I always do, you can actually just patchwork it on. It doesn't matter that the shapes are perfect. But I have a real like retro, from growing up, I love the lacy edged ones. I don't care for the no-bake ones. I think that they do work in some recipes that are expecting you to use them, but for most of them, they're just going to take the moisture out of the sauce. And unless your sauce is accommodating that, or if you've done something like pre-soak them, it's going to mess up like a bechamel, which is less wet. It's gonna detract from it, I think.
Are there kinds of lasagna that you've experimented or recipe developed over the years that were total failures? Have you ever made a disaster lasagna?
I know I've definitely made some bad lasagnas before, but I I think my favorite though is just the basic bechamel. And the other one I wanted to do a classic lasagna bolognese for years and years. And it's definitely one of like the hardest recipes for me to get right. Like it took me forever, but once I did, it's really like, that was something that once a year for a dinner party, not even like once every 2 years for a dinner party, I'll make like 2 of them. And it's like the centerpiece. Like you can't eat anything all day. I'm making lasagna bolognese tonight. I'll be offended.
What was so hard to get right about that recipe?
I found it was really hard. First of all, you have to find 2 people who agree on what lasagna bolognese is. And also to get the numbers right. Like I feel like, a lot of it's just handed down recipe and got extra bolognese or whatever. But like to actually get the sauce level right, to actually say, here's 1 layer of noodles and you're looking to put half a cup of sauce between them and 2/3 of a cup of this. I find that's really helpful, and to know how much you'll need and how much is too much. Because if you're making it for the first time, wouldn't you like some guidance onto like what the really nice balance is so it's not too rich and not too dry?
Cool. Thanks for talking to us about lasagna. The Taste podcast is hosted by Matt Rodbard and me, Anna Heasel. It's produced by Gabrielle Lewis. Our theme music is by Steve Raydell. Interviews are recorded live at Books Are Magic in Cobble Hill, Brooklyn. Special thanks to the Books Are Magic family, Emma, Mike, and Michael. Confidence wine supplied by Smitten Wine. Visit Taste online at tastecooking.com. Thanks for listening.